Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or should I say you Montana heroes. I got an email from my brother in Oregon tonight. They're battening down for the Oregon snow apocalypse. And I said, what counts as an apocalypse for you guys? Come back to Montana, you'll know what snow apocalypse is. But you're heroes for being here, and I'm grateful. My name is Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of the Alumni Association Community Lecture Series, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third lecture in our 2019 Community Lecture Series. This series was put together 22 years ago as a way to showcase University of Montana faculty and the amazing research that goes on this campus so that people in the community can have a greater appreciation of just how valuable the university is, not only to the students, but to the community and for the greater state of Montana. Please check and see that your phones are turned off. This year, like every year, our format is we will have a lecture, and following the lecture, you in the audience will have an opportunity to talk with our speaker and ask questions or make comments. During the lecture, please think of things that you want to find out more about. We will have microphones available for you to ask your questions with, and I'll ask that you please speak into the microphones directly, just as I'm doing, so that we can make sure that your questions get captured for our later video cast. MCAT is here tonight. They give the Alumni Association a community grant for the videotaping and airing of our lectures every year. So in order to have our future viewers capture or hear what your question is, please speak directly into the microphone so that they can hear what it is you're interested in. Before I introduce our speaker, as we're doing in every lecture, I'm going to introduce tonight's lecture with a poem about the moon. In researching poems about the moon, I was amazed. You think there are a lot of poems about the moon? There's more than you think. There are way more than you think. Tonight's poet is Shel Silverstein. He's a poet that likes to write a lot of poems for kids, and he likes to write poems for adults, and I'm not sure who he wrote this one for, but I liked it, and it's about the moon. It's called Moon Catcher Net. I've made me a moon catching net, and I'm going hunting tonight. I'll run along swinging it over my head and grab for that big ball of light. So tomorrow just look at the sky, and if there's no moon, you can bet I found what I sought, and I finally caught the moon in my moon-catching net. But if the moon's still shining there, look close underneath and you'll get a clear look at me in the sky swinging free with a star in my moon-catching net. Tonight's lecturer is Mike Mayer from the university's Department of History. He is the university's, I'll dare say, foremost authority on the Eisenhower years, which happens to be the year that the Russians launched Sputnik. So I'm going to ask you to please welcome Professor Mike Mayer.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for coming out. It is not the best night to come out and hear a talk, so you really did brave the elements. Space, as Captain Kirk repeatedly told us, is the final frontier. But the first people to get there were the Germans during World War II. At the end of the war, the American military began an operation called Paperclip, which was an effort to find German rocket scientists and German rocket parts and German rocket documents. And among those scientists was Wernher von Braun, whose picture is up there. He headed Germany's V-2 program. The V-2 was the first successful ballistic missile. Von Braun regarded the A-4, as it was called in the development and testing stage, as a step toward his ultimate goal, which was building rockets powerful enough to reach space. but it went into production as the V2. Hitler named it. It was called the Vergeltungswaffen, a revenge weapon, and it was first fired as a V2 in July 1942. It reached an altitude of approximately 1 yard and blew up. The second test failed too. But finally, on October 3rd, 1942, the first successful launch took place. The rocket broke the sound barrier and reached an altitude of 55 miles. That was the birth of the space age. But let's be clear about one thing. Wernher von Braun was primarily interested in space. The Nazis were interested in weapons. And the first use of the V2 as a weapon came on September 8th, 1944. It was launched against London. The rocket was 46 feet long, 5.5 feet in diameter. It weighed 28,000 pounds, most of which was fuel and fuel tank. It had 56,000 pounds of thrust, and it took 6 minutes to hit London. It gave no warning. The rocket actually arrived before the sound did. By the war's end, the Germans had fired 3,745 rockets. 60,000 slave laborers worked making these rockets in absolutely horrific conditions. 20,000 of them died. In fact, more people died making the V2 than died from its use as a weapon. But having said that, it's important to realize these weren't toys. These were deadly weapons. One landed on a market in London, killed 100 people. And by the end of the war, von Braun and his team were working on rockets that could reach America. The A9 and the A10, they weren't obviously ready for use, so they weren't even in developmental stage. But these were multi-stage rockets. These were the forerunners of ICBMs. As World War II drew to a close, von Braun called his team together, and he told them, Germany has lost the war, but let us not forget that it was our team which first succeeded in reaching outer space. And then he asked them which side they thought to which side they thought they should entrust their heritage. The scientists voted to remain together and to offer their services to the Americans. As one put it, we were scared of the Russians. We didn't like the French. The British couldn't afford us, so it was the Americans. The team slipped out of their headquarters at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, and with the aid of faked papers, reached Bavaria and American forces. Von Braun later acknowledged that he wanted to surrender to the Americans because they were more likely to support his research in rocketry, and because, as he put it, the next time I wanted to be on the winning side. Von Braun, who looks so benign up there, was a curious character. He was single-mindedly focused on rocketry and a desire to put a missile into space. He was a true visionary who imagined manned space flights to the moon and to Mars. In fact, the Gestapo arrested him briefly during the war because they suspected that he placed too much emphasis on space and not enough on developing the V2 as an effective weapon. Von Braun, in some ways, is just an alarming figure. Not because he was a Nazi. He really wasn't much of a Nazi. Or even because he was immoral. Rather, he seems to have been completely amoral. And in some ways is because of that, a terrifying figure. In the 1950s, I see some people out here who might remember, there was a satirist and singer named Tom Lehrer, and he wrote a ditty called the Wernher von Braun song. And the line that captures everything says, once they go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my problem, says Wernher von Braun. That was about right. The comedian Mort Sahl was referred to a movie about von Braun's life. It was a popular movie. It was called Aim for the Stars. Mort Sahl suggested maybe there should be a subtitle, but sometimes I hit London. Von Braun brought with him over 100 scientists, and in addition led the Americans to several V2s, complete V2s, and gave them documents. Stalin was absolutely furious. The Soviets did manage to pick up a second tier of German rocket scientists, mostly engineers and minor technicians. This was still important for the Soviets because under the Tsars, and especially during World War II, Russian and then Soviet rocket scientists had to focus on the theoretical. There wasn't a lot of money for them to do practical applications, but the acquisition of the German technicians enabled them to leap over a lot of the practical experience that the war had denied them. At the end of the war, in 1945, Germany was well ahead of other nations in the development of rockets. The Soviets were probably second, and the United States trailed. During the war, the United States had devoted most of its scientific resources to the development of the atomic bomb. But getting von Braun and his team made the United States instantly competitive. Von Braun and his team landed at White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. That must have been a culture shock. And there they continued their work. In 1950, prompted by the Soviet acquisition of atomic weapons, the Truman administration gave priority, or at least they said they did, to a missile program. He named a missile czar, K.T. Keller, the president of Chrysler. Keller held the job for 11 months. He never gave up his day job at Chrysler, and he never briefed the president on missiles. It makes you wonder about how much priority there really was there. But Truman also wanted to cut defense spending. And in the budget battles that ensued, the missiles lost out to the B-36 bomber. The money went to the Strategic Air Command. That was the first priority. But by 1950, von Braun and the boys, along with the Army Ordnance Guided Missile Center, were transferred to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, which must have been another culture shock for the guys. Von Braun dreamed of putting a satellite into space, but that required multi-stage rockets. And in 1949, he used a reworked V-2 to boost a WAC Corporal, which was an American rocket, to an altitude of 250 miles. In 1951, the Air Force began developing an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was called Atlas. In 1952, the United States exploded the first hydrogen device. It was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. By the mid-50s, the Soviets also possessed hydrogen bombs and were making progress toward ICBMs. In 1954, the United States began a more aggressive program to build an ICBM, and it focused on the Air Force's Atlas. President Eisenhower convened a panel of experts to study the danger of a surprise attack. It was headed by James F. Killian, the president of MIT. And the Gaither Report emphasized a couple of things. One was the importance of retaliatory capacity. Another was the need for intelligence. This is really the origin of the U-2 spy plane. The Killian group reported the Soviets were on their way to developing an ICBM, and they argued that the United States needed at least roughly to match the timetable. And so while the Air Force worked on the Atlas, it also began a new generation of missiles, the solid-fueled Minuteman. It was cheaper, it was powerful enough to carry a hydrogen bomb, and it was the first effective deterrent to a surprise attack because it could be launched within 60 seconds of an alert. The earlier rockets took a long time to launch. The Minuteman was a big advance in that regard. Each of the armed services embarked on the development of intermediate-range ballistic missiles. All of them were operative by the end of the 1950s. And Eisenhower famously warned in his farewell address of the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. But that wasn't a new concern for him. He'd always been worried about that, and he worried about the drain that armaments placed on the economy. He worried about the possible inflation that a rapid buildup of the military might cause. And this accounted for the new look defense policy of the Eisenhower administration. It was an emphasis on air power, technology, nuclear deterrent. Above all, Eisenhower relied on these weapon systems because, as expensive as they are, they're cheaper than conventional forces. Eisenhower cut the defense budget substantially throughout his 2 terms. It was also a response to Korea, because nobody wanted to do that again. That meant, though, that American policymakers were determined to keep the United States ahead of the Soviet Union. And between 1954 and 1960, Congress quadrupled the budget for a high-energy accelerator. Members of Congress talked about an atomic power race. But in the meantime, the Russians, the Soviets, who had not been all that far behind the Germans in developing rockets at the end of the war, got a boost from their acquisition of the second tier of rocket scientists from Germany. Before long, the Soviets had their own version of the V-2, but that had a range of no more than 400 kilometers. Georgy Malenkov observed, "We have no intention of making war on Poland." In other words, the V-2 wasn't that much use to them, and the Soviets determined to build an ICBM. By 1949, they developed their T-1 model that had a range of 500 miles. By 1952, they were at work on the T-2. The year after that, in 1953, Stalin died, and for a period there was a collective leadership. Before long, Nikita Khrushchev consolidated his control over the Central Committee and became the dominant figure in the Soviet Union. At the 20th Party Congress in 1956, he denounced Stalin as a tyrant and called for de-Stalinization. Although de-Stalinization was more apparent than real. Rioters in Poland took Khrushchev at face value, demanded an appointment of an anti-Stalinist head of state. They were disappointed. Insurgents in Hungary mounted an outright challenge to Soviet rule, and Khrushchev responded with tanks. By the mid-1950s, the Soviets were well on their way to the development of the R-7, which would become their basic rocket of the decade. By 1955, the Soviets began to talk about launching an Earth satellite during the International Geophysical Year. That was 1957 to 58. It started on July 1st. American policymakers in the mid-50s worried about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The Soviet Union was a highly secretive society. It was a vast territory. The possibility of effective inspections seemed negligible at best. And the CIA became particularly concerned about missile testing at Kapustin Yar, which is about 75 miles east of Stalingrad. But a base at Toryadam seemed absolutely beyond the capacity of the United States to conduct any meaningful surveillance. Early attempts to penetrate Soviet airspace with balloons turned out not very well. And by the summer of 1955, the Air Force had the technology to take a picture of a golf ball from 55,000 feet, but they needed something to carry that camera. Military and intelligence officials wanted to develop a plane that could conduct surveillance. And when they brought the plan to Eisenhower, he asked them, are these intelligence benefits going to outweigh the risks of violating Soviet airspace? And they convinced him that it would. Eisenhower said he did not want uniformed Air Force pilots violating Soviet airspace, so the project therefore became a CIA one. The result was the U-2, a lightweight plane capable of remaining in the air for 11 hours, or 4,750 miles. It could fly initially at 70,000 feet, then 80,000 feet before long. And by 1956, U-2s were conducting overflights of the Soviet Union. There was some hope in the intelligence community in this country that they would be able to fly above Soviet radar. That proved to be wrong. But they did fly above the capabilities of Soviet air defense. And that's why the Soviets didn't make a public fuss about this, because they didn't want to admit that they were impotent to do anything about these American planes flying over their territory. The intelligence provided by the U-2 overflights provided crucial information for policymakers. it really is amazing. The U-2 could photograph a parking lot from 14 miles up and could photograph it with such clarity that you could actually see the lines marking individual parking spaces, which is better than you can do in the lot outside right now tonight. U-2 overflights established a couple of important things. One is there was no bomber gap. They also showed that while the Soviets were working on missiles, they had not yet launched an ICBM. That was reassuring to military leaders and to the president. But by the nature of secret surveillance, the public did not know about this and couldn't know about it. In the summer of 1956, von Braun was convinced that the Soviets were preparing to launch a satellite. And he was confident that he and his team could do it as well. Von Braun and his colleagues were working on a rocket called the Redstone. It wasn't very different from the V-2, but it was larger, it was more powerful, and it was first successfully tested in 1953, in August. It was capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. As the 50s rolled along, von Braun became the leading advocate of spaceflight in the United States. He authored or co-authored a series of articles, he wrote books, he made numerous speeches, he made appearances on television, and he pressed the case for space exploration, which was his passion, if not his obsession. In 1951, he proposed that the United States develop a donut-shaped space station. In 52, his book, Mars Project, envisioned the eventual construction of an interplanetary space fleet. Von Braun became an American citizen in 1955 at the age of 43, and he became an enthusiastic American at that. He loved barbecue, he loves deep sea diving, and became, curiously enough, a fan of democracy. Von Braun believed, with good reason, that a Redstone could launch an Earth satellite by 1956. Back in 1954, he'd written a report, A Minimum Satellite Vehicle, which requested, and this seems like a paltry sum, $100,000. He said, even a 5-pound satellite would be, quote, a scientific achievement of tremendous impact. And he warned that it is only logical to assume that other countries could do the same. And then he wrote in italics, it would be a blow to U.S. prestige if we did not do it first. In 1955, von Braun's team elaborated on the Redstone to devise rockets capable of the higher speeds necessary for intermediate-range ballistic missiles. The resulting, let's see if we can get that. That's not it, that's not it. There we go. The resulting rocket was the Jupiter. The Jupiter was basically a Redstone rocket with 2 additional stages. And with the approach of the International Geophysical Year, the American government all of a sudden showed renewed interest in space flight and missile programs. And on July 28, 1955, Jim Haggerty, Eisenhower's press secretary, announced that America planned to launch a space satellite, as part of the International Geophysical Year. The Soviets, in the meantime, were talking ever more confidently about their ability to launch a satellite. And 2 days after the American announcement, the Soviets announced that they planned to launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year. Eisenhower was sort of interested in this, but he understood the real value of getting a satellite up there, and that was reconnaissance. In February of 1956, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency was established. It incorporated the Redstone Arsenal's Guided Missile Division. Von Braun became the director. Eventually, he'd become the head. Various branches of the military jockeyed for the honor of launching the satellite. The Navy was working on a Viking rocket based on the V-2. It was designed to probe the upper atmosphere for scientific purposes. The Air Force was developing an ICBM with a thin upper stage, the WAC Corporal. The Navy's Viking was, to be generous, at the experimental stage. It was much smaller than the Redstone. Its upper stages needed to be designed from scratch. They didn't have anything on the books for a second or third stage. But there was no doubt that von Braun and the Army were way ahead of the other branches. But the Navy had a better satellite, and they had better support. And so the government chose the Navy. That choice of an experimental first stage and 3 entirely new stages seems sort of curious. In fact, in retrospect, given that the Soviets got Sputnik up first, seems disastrous. But the fact is that the Viking booster, ultimately did launch a satellite during the International Geophysical Year, although it didn't beat the Soviets and it didn't beat von Braun and his team. So why did the government choose this chancier Navy rocket? I think the key to that decision was the insistence, particularly on the part of Eisenhower, on the civilian character of the satellite program. The Viking was a scientific rocket constructed by private industry. Redstone was a military missile developed in an Army arsenal, and it was designed primarily to carry nuclear weapons. In addition, as Eisenhower observed in his memoirs, the satellite program was part of the International Geophysical Year. And that meant that the world expected that the information from that would be given freely to all nations, and the missile program, particularly the Army's missile program, involved key defense secrets that needed to be guarded. But in the end, I think it really came down to this. For Eisenhower and his administration, speed, getting something up first, was less important than that they maintain the civilian character of the project. Eisenhower wanted, above all, to demonstrate America's peaceful intentions in space. And so he announced publicly that the Navy's Vanguard, based on the Viking, a scientific research rocket, would carry the first U.S. satellite. America's political leaders weren't foolish. They understood that the Army and von Braun really had the best chance of putting something up in space first. And Eisenhower ordered the Secretary of Defense, Charles Wilson, to have von Braun keep a modified Redstone available just in case the Navy didn't make it. While the administration worked through these various issues, von Braun's team continued to do their work, and on September 20th, 1956, they launched a Jupiter C. It was a 4-stage rocket. The 4th stage could have gone into orbit, but the orders were that it not be a live satellite. Von Braun was bitterly disappointed by that, but the launch was a great success. It reached an altitude of 682 miles. It achieved a speed of 13,000 miles per hour, and as I said, in all likelihood, could have put a satellite into space. But the Navy program was encountering serious problems, and so too were the Soviets. The R-7, a huge rocket, was designed to carry the primitive Soviet atom bombs that weighed 2 tons. And in late spring of 1957, the first R-7 exploded on the launch pad. It was followed by a series of failures. Finally, on August 3rd, the Soviets successfully launched an R-7. It didn't carry a satellite, but the Soviets were very close. On August 26th, Khrushchev announced that a super long-distance intercontinental multi-stage ballistic missile was launched a few days ago. And then on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. There we go. Sputnik, which means fellow traveler, was the first human-made satellite to orbit the Earth. It was a small aluminum sphere, as you can see. It weighed 184 pounds. It was 22.8 inches in diameter and contained 2 radio transmitters, which emitted a radio signal. Those of you old enough will remember that beep, 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 beep that we all listened to as Sputnik circled the Earth. It's ironic, but the Soviets' seeming advantage in rocketry derived, at least in part, from the fact that they were technologically well behind the United States. They trailed in miniaturization, in sophisticated aircraft, in guidance systems. Perhaps above all, the United States had a substantial lead in long-range bombers. What's more, the United States had bases close to Soviet borders, In short, the United States really didn't need large thrust rockets to hit the Soviet Union the way the Soviet Union did. But still, I think some members of the administration badly miscalculated the impact of Sputnik. Charles Wilson, the Secretary of Defense, who had incurable foot and mouth disease, called Sputnik a useless hunk of iron. I mean, Wilson, the joke was he'd been the president of General Motors. The joke was he invented the automatic transmission so he could drive with his foot in his mouth. Sherman Adams, Eisenhower's chief of staff, said that the United States was not interested in getting caught up in an outer space basketball game. But the public wasn't placated by comments like that, and at a press conference on October 9th, Merriman Smith asked the president, or told the president, I guess, Russia has launched an Earth satellite. They also claim to have had a successful firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile, none of which this country has done. I ask you, sir, what are we going to do about it? Eisenhower pointed out that there was no link between launching Sputnik and an ICBM, and further, Sputnik did not prove that the Soviets had an ICBM that could actually hit a target. Hazel Markle of NBC asked, Mr. President, in light of the great faith which the American people have in your military knowledge and leadership, are you saying at this time, with a Russian satellite whirling around the world, you're not more concerned nor overly concerned about our nation's security? Eisenhower acknowledged that Sputnik proved the Russians had powerful, large-thrust rockets. But, he said, as far as the satellite's concerned, that does not raise my apprehensions, not one iota. I can see nothing at this moment, at this stage of development, that is significant in that development as far as security is concerned. Eisenhower also observed, suddenly all America seems to become scientists. And in fact, most weren't. Eisenhower was telling the truth. U-2 photographs gave him solid reason for his confidence. Unfortunately, he couldn't share the basis for his confidence with the public. Some of the younger advisors in the administration, particularly the Vice President, Richard Nixon, and a White House aide, Nelson Rockefeller, understood the propaganda value of Sputnik. Democrats had been criticizing Eisenhower for cutting defense spending. Since the mid-50s, they'd been calling for increases in defense spending, for increases in conventional forces, and picking up on the popular critique that Americans were more concerned about cars with big tail fins and chrome than they were about the future of the country. Lyndon Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, said, it is not very reassuring to be told that next year we'll put a better satellite in the air. Perhaps it will even have chrome trim and automatic windshield wipers. Johnson also warned that the country that held the high ground in space could control the world. He said, soon the Soviets will be dropping bombs on us from space like kids dropping rocks onto cars from freeway overpasses. It's a good thing that he didn't get overheated about that. George Reedy, Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, wrote a memo in which he argued this issue is one which, if properly handled, would blast the Republicans out of the water, unify the Democratic Party, and elect you president. But Johnson wasn't alone. Stuart Symington, John Kennedy, all of whom had aspirations for the White House in 1960, pushed this issue. And Khrushchev also couldn't resist the temptation to gloat. He saw it as a victory over American materialism. He and Johnson agreed on that. He boasted that the Soviets could launch such a satellite any time. And he said, we will produce rockets like this by the dozens, like sausages. Also, Khrushchev bragged that Sputnik was proof that the Soviets could deliver hydrogen bombs at will. The fact was that the first artificial satellite and in the intrinsically more important rocket that launched it were incremental and predictable feats of engineering. Both superpowers, as I've suggested, have been working in that direction since 1945. What's more, as Eisenhower pointed out, the ability of an impressively large rocket to launch a satellite into rough orbital trajectory was not the same thing as the ability of an ICBM to pinpoint a target. Ultimately, though, what made Sputnik significant was not its military use. It was that the United States had assumed responsibility as a leader of the free world, and that was based on the superiority of American institutions, not only ideological institutions like freedom, but a superiority in technology and the technology of weapons. And that technology would protect America's allies from destruction. NATO never had anything more than a tripwire force against the Soviet Red Army. If the Soviet Red Army had decided to roll across the frontier, the NATO forces couldn't delay them for more than 48 hours by any military projection. And Sputnik seemed to make a lie both of the superiority of American institutions and American technology. Some argued that the reliance on the marketplace, a marketplace corrupted by consumerism, had become anachronistic in an age of explosive technological developments. On the day Sputnik was launched, Neil McElroy, who would soon replace Charles Wilson as Secretary of Defense, was visiting Huntsville. And when news of the Soviet launch arrived, von Braun's frustrations just exploded. He told McElroy, "We knew they were going to do it." He added, "Navy's Vanguard will never make it. We have the hardware on the shelf. We could put a satellite up in 60 days. McElroy listened, went back to Washington, consulted with the president, and sent instructions to von Braun to prepare to launch a satellite with a Jupiter rocket as a backup to Navy's Vanguard. On November 3rd, the Soviets sent up Sputnik 2. It was large enough to carry a live dog, Laika, not for long, live dog, but the Soviets clearly had large thrust rockets. And at this point, it was no major technological feat to put a tin can in space. The United States had guidance systems, sophisticated aircraft miniaturization, and also more sophisticated satellites ready to go up. The United States did not have the need to build large rockets to deliver large nuclear weapons. In military terms, the sophisticated satellites that I mentioned were more useful. They could track weather. They contain global positioning systems, all of which much more useful than shooting a doomed puppy into space. What's more, if the United States was, in fact, marginally behind the Soviets in the development of ICBMs, it was comfortably ahead in guidance technology, warhead design, solid fuel technology, and so on. In fact, by August 1960, completely unknown to the public, a U.S. satellite yielded pictures of 1.5 million square feet of Soviet territory, including detailed photographs of 64 airfields, 26 surface-to-air missile sites, and a major rocket facilities. In just a matter of days, that satellite yielded more information than all of the U-2 flights had yielded. With respect to space, as opposed to space exploration, as opposed to just military development, the United States had been developing in the late 40s and early 50s the X-15, a pilotable, reusable spacecraft. But once the Soviets put a tin can in space, the United States abandoned the X-15 and rushed to build large rockets so they too could put a tin can in space. The first American effort came on December 6, 1957. The Navy's Vanguard rocket, in a nationally televised event, lifted 6 inches and exploded on the launch pad. The press had a field day. Kaputnik, one headline read. Or Flopnik, another. Stay Putnik was a good one. Oopsnik was one of my favorites. And the New York Times began an editorial with the headline Sputternik. This event was followed by a series of launch pad explosions or faulty trajectories. One headed toward downtown Orlando and had to be blown up before it did any damage. It fell eventually to von Braun and his team to recoup American prestige. On January 31st, 1958, America launched Explorer, the first American satellite. It went higher than Sputnik, but it weighed only 18 pounds. The first Sputnik was 184. The second Sputnik was 1,160 pounds. Khrushchev belittled the American satellite. He said it's small, like an orange. It actually was, as I mentioned before, in scientific terms, much more sophisticated. Testifying before the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee in December 1957, von Braun proposed that the U.S. establish a national space agency with a $1.5 billion annual budget. He told the subcommittee that such an agency could have a man orbiting the Earth on a returnable basis within 5 years and could produce a manned space station within 10 years. In the meantime, America's various programs to develop new large thrust rockets, continued to have failures. They had great names, Atlas, Navajo, Little Joe, Jupiter, but they all blew up. Now, this was not extraordinary. These were test events. Blown engines are normal in the course of testing. And no one was putting a human being on top of one of these candles until they were relatively reliable. But on television, in an open society, these normal test events became colossal national failures. And Americans blamed their second place status in the space race in large part, on American education, especially on progressive education, as described by John Dewey. Critics of progressive education argued it encouraged low standards, fuzzy logic, poor work habits, and ignorance. They also argued that it ignored the needs of bright students. Arthur Bester, a historian at the University of Illinois, published a book in 1953 called Educational Wasteland. He denounced what he called the retreat from learning in public schools and said that progressive education's emphasis on life adjustment was, quote, a parody of education. He advocated rigorous standards, active involvement in scholarship by teachers, and a liberal education as opposed to a narrowly vocational one. In 1955, Rudolf Flesch published Why Johnny Can't Read. It advocated a phonics approach to teaching reading. And James B. Conant, the physicist, the former president of Harvard, the U.S. ambassador to West Germany, published The American High School in 1959. It sold nearly 500,000 copies. It criticized American schools for failing to teach English, grammar, composition, for ignoring brighter students, and he argued that for the sake of the nation, bright students should undertake demanding programs of study. He said there was nothing inherently wrong with progressive education's comprehensive high school, but he argued for a core, a strong core of English, math, social science. He said teacher education should stress knowledge of subjects rather than pedagogy. Vice Admiral Hyman Rickover also published a book in which he assaulted life adjustment education. He said educators were placing the country's security in jeopardy by failing to stress intellectual competence. The future, he wrote, belongs to the best educated nation. One result of Sputnik was a much greater emphasis on science in American public schools. In the aftermath of Sputnik, there was a long series of people questioning the American national will. Even before Sputnik, in the spring of 1957, the National Security Council commissioned Rowan Gaither to head a study of Soviet offensive capabilities and American defense requirements. Gaither became ill with cancer almost immediately after the project got underway and couldn't really participate, but it became known as the Gaither Committee, and its report was known as the Gaither Report. It was submitted to the National Security Council in November after the launch of Sputnik, and it presented a grim estimation of the relative strengths of the United States and the Soviet Union. The Gaither Report noted that Soviet GDP was about a third of the United States, but it was growing faster. But Soviet defense spending just about equaled the United States. The report predicted the Soviets would have 100 ICBMs by the end of the decade, and that the bombers of the Strategic Air Command, except those that were in the air, there were always SAC bombers in the air, in fact, until the Soviet Union collapsed, that all the others would be vulnerable. What's more, the report predicted that future wars were likely to be limited, and therefore it was necessary to expand conventional forces and increase defense budgets. Once Sputnik 2 went up, parts of this highly classified report were leaked to the press. Led by Johnson, Democrats demanded that the report be released. Eisenhower refused to do so, a position Gaither supported. John Kennedy also later refused to release the report. In his memoirs, Eisenhower noted that he did not agree with the panel's, quote, hypothetical figures. Moreover, he wrote, the panel had failed to take into account certain vital information and other considerations. For example, the Gaither Committee had neglected to consider that American overseas bases gave dispersion and could pose a threat to the Soviet Union from a multitude of different points. But after Sputnik, the public outcry for increased emphasis on science education, increased defense spending, just would not die down. Eisenhower appointed James Killian of MIT, the president of MIT, to the newly created position of Special Assistant to the President for Science and Technology. He also ordered the removal of the Science Advisory Committee from the Office of Defense Mobilization into the White House, and he appointed Killian to chair that committee. Like Eisenhower, Killian was worried that the reaction to Sputnik would lead to panic-driven spending that would damage the economy and result in very little scientific achievement. One study that Killian oversaw recommended keeping the military space programs in the military, within the Defense Department, but it also recommended the creation of a civilian space agency. The report was released in July 1958, and that same month, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The Army turned over the Redstone Arsenal's rocket program to NASA, and von Braun became director of NASA's facility in Huntsville, which was in 1960 renamed the George C. Marshall Flight Center. Another response to Sputnik was the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which provided low-interest loans for deserving college students, provided grants to improve the teaching of math and science in public schools. Some of you, like me, may have been subjected to the new math because of that, and that was one of the consequences. That was really unfortunate, at least for me. It also provided graduate fellowships to prospective college and university teachers. Still, the public was unsettled by Sputnik. Eisenhower resisted pressure from Democratic critics to increase defense spending dramatically, to increase spending on the development of missiles dramatically, but he did adjust some priorities and add modest sums, particularly to defense spending. Nevertheless, he resisted calls for massive increases. Shortly after Sputnik, Eisenhower authorized the Secretary of Defense, Neil McElroy, to seek a supplemental appropriation of $1.26 billion for the remainder of fiscal year 58. The money was to accelerate existing missile programs. In private, Eisenhower and McElroy acknowledged that most of the supplementary funding served, quote, more to stabilize public opinion than to meet the need for real acceleration. McElroy testified before the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee in November of 1957 and admitted that the Soviet Union was, quote, obviously ahead of the United States in missiles that could put a satellite into orbit, but in spite of constant prodding by the senators, he refused to agree that the Soviets had a lead in long-range missiles. Several months later, McElroy argued against a crash program to develop missiles. He said a rather frenetic program would be of dubious effectiveness. Critics at the time, and some in the years after that, argued that Eisenhower was out of touch. He actually understood the issues a lot better than most of his critics. He was concerned with the moral and economic consequences of a headlong race for technological and moral superiority with the Soviets. He was disturbed by the political and social consequences of vastly increased federal power in education and science and the economy. And he worried, as he would later express in his farewell address, about the inordinate power and influence of the military-industrial complex and a scientific technological elite. Robert Devine, a historian who taught for many years at the University of Texas and specialized in American foreign policy, wrote a book about Sputnik, and he argued that Eisenhower's policy in response to Sputnik was his greatest achievement in the White House. His calm assessment of the military and security issues, Devine argued, was spot on. He resisted pressure for excessive and useless spending in response to the Soviet launch. First of all, R&D can only absorb so much at a time, particularly at early stages. What's more, Eisenhower's caps on defense spending did not endanger U.S. security. In fact, as Devine and many other historians have pointed out, the late 1950s was the period of maximum U.S. superiority. When Eisenhower left office, the United States came closest at any time during the Cold War to what strategists call a first strike capability, which means that if you launch first, you do enough damage that their ability to retaliate is limited and your losses will fall within acceptable range. I guess that depends, acceptable depends which city you're in and whether or not your city is destroyed. But the 50s was not, as so many people argued at the time and in a decade or two after that, a period of complacency. The mid and late 50s were probably the most dynamic years of American research and development. Walter McDougall, a historian who's written about space and space exploration, contends that there were more new starts and technological leaps in the years leading up to 1960 than in any other comparable span in American history. And he has a point. Every space booster, every strategic missile in the American arsenal until the space station and the Trident missile of the 1970s dated from the mid to late 1950s. Atlas, Polaris, Minuteman. Devine also argues, though, that Eisenhower's greatest failure was his ability to persuade the American people of the basic security and safety, of their basic security and safety. Devine's point is an interesting one. I can't help but wonder if anyone acting responsibly could have assuaged the fears of the American people. It certainly couldn't have been done, it seems to me, without profligate spending, without centralized direction of R&D, and without some pretty alarming rhetoric, all of which Eisenhower hoped to avoid. Democrats like Symington and Johnson and Kennedy used the issue to advance their political ambitions, which made it even more difficult to rein in the temptation to just spend money on projects that may or may not be worthwhile. Eisenhower did not use the information gleaned from U-2 overflights to contradict his Democratic critics or to reassure the American public. It would have been irresponsible to do so, to reveal the sources of this information. And he was willing to take a political hit to maintain the secret intelligence. This was, I think, at the very least, a responsible decision not to expose intelligence assets or risk security for political advantage. But nevertheless, the space race was now on, and in the early stages, the Soviets achieved a number of firsts. The U.S. quickly matched them. The first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, on April 12, 1961, also became the first human to orbit the Earth. The U.S. put its first man in space, Alan Shepard, on May 5, 1961, but his flight was suborbital, although that was the first pilot-controlled space flight. In late May of 1961, John Kennedy decided to give a second State of the Union address. In it, he called for achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. In July of that year, the United States launched the first communication satellite, Telstar. Some of you may remember that. And von Braun continued to play a large role in the U.S. space program. The first two Americans in space, Alan Shepard and Virgil Grissom, rode in capsules powered by Redstone launchers. Von Braun also oversaw the development of the large Saturn rocket used by the Apollo missions that would eventually result in the moon landing. Von Braun was perhaps the leading advocate within the space program that a manned flight to the moon should be the focus for the American space program. And then finally, go back, there we go. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped out of the lunar lander, the Eagle, and took one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind. Thank you very much. Okay, people who have questions need to find them. Where are the microphones? Okay, we're getting them.
If you have questions, raise your hands and we'll get the microphones to you.
Anybody?
I have one. How long did the Sputnik stay in orbit and functioning?
I don't know. Anybody? A while, yes. It went beep, beep, beep for a while and then stopped beeping, but I think it stayed in orbit. Eventually, its orbit deteriorated and crashed, but I don't know. I have no idea how long it took. There's somebody way in the back.
The first U-2 pictures that were taken of the Soviet Union, are those available to be seen now?
That's a good question. I don't know. I seem to be saying that a lot. I always tell TAs, don't be afraid to say, I don't know, if you don't know. Well, there you go. Some of those still may be classified. I just don't know. I'm not a historian of technology. Yeah.
Those two radios that were on Sputnik, do you know what they were transceiving?
No, I don't, but I know that the Soviets told everybody what frequency to tune into so you could hear the beep, 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 beep. And we all did.
Did that scare the American public hearing?
Oh, yeah. The Soviets were in space, and there's beep, 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 beep to remind you that the Soviets were in space. And as Lyndon Johnson said, they're going to be raining down hydrogen bombs on us. Fortunately, this thing weighed 184 pounds, and the Soviet nuclear arsenal was still, they hadn't gotten very far with miniaturization. I said, even as late as the mid-50s, their atomic weapons were 2 tons. So the ability to put a 184-pound sphere in space wasn't exactly the ability to launch massive hydrogen bomb attacks. There's...
A naive question. Someone once asked me, it's a question by saying, it seems to me as we have been launching larger and larger pop bottle rockets to get things into space, and while I'm sure there's technology in the engines, is there not a more advanced technology for getting rockets up there besides big pop bottle rockets?
Again, I mean, there was a space shuttle. I'm not an expert on this at all, but the space shuttle had a different method of launching, although it's very similar. You got three not very little real rockets alongside the big launcher, but apparently the real difficulty is staging. That's what took both sides knew. We've got these rockets. You put the things in. You eventually can escape Earth's atmosphere. The question was staging, and that seemed to be difficult, and there were a whole bunch of different answers, some of which were more elegant than others. But the United States got up there with relatively small rockets, as I said, because they're more sophisticated technology. The satellites are more sophisticated. Guidance systems are more sophisticated. So we weren't building these giant rockets that the Soviets were building. They weren't sure they could hit Washington. So they needed to have a big bomb, so if they got close, it would do the job. And so they needed bigger and bigger and bigger rockets to carry that bomb, and eventually someone stuck a tin can on top of one of them because it had enough power to put it in orbit. And so it's not just size, but it's true. We immediately started building bigger and bigger rockets to try to get a tin can into space too. There's Arlene.
Right, you're next. I was going to ask.
It's good to have the mic, isn't it?
It is. When President Kennedy declared the goal to put a man on the moon, was the congressional response bipartisan? Did everybody kind of jump on board with that, or were there big fights over the funding of?
No, there really weren't. Once it was articulated, eventually there was some discussion about the cost and whether that should be the primary focus, as opposed to military defense or something else. But in general, there was pretty good support for it. I mean, for Kennedy, it was a pretty good political stunt. His first State of the Union message hadn't gone as well as he had hoped. And so he took the unusual step, as I mentioned, of giving a second State of the Union message to kind of get it right this time. And that's when he made this dramatic promise to put a man on the moon and return safely to Earth within the decade.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with this topic is it's bringing out memories that are really way far back in there. And you started with von Braun, but when was Goddard?
Very good question. That's the 1920s.
Okay.
It's interesting, both the United States and then Russia and then the Soviet Union in the early years had crackpots who were interested in space travel and rockets. And Goddard was one in the United States. I mean, he was. Now we name a space one of the big installations of NASA after him. But at the time, he was regarded as kind of a crackpot. And all of them, Russian and American, were inspired by science fiction. Jules Verne and these things, and they really were interested in rockets. Von Braun was interested in rocketry in the 20s and 30s. He became a Nazi, not out of ideological fervor, but because these were the guys who were going to pay for him to play with his rockets, which, again, as Lear said, who cares who they fall on? As long as he could build rockets, he really didn't care. But this goes back, the idea of jet propulsion and rocketry goes back to the early 20th century, and there were some pretty sophisticated thinkers and designers. In some cases, they didn't have the technology. The metallurgy wasn't up to it. The things would melt if you provided enough thrust. There weren't engines that had large enough thrust. But the concept, the basic theoretical design was there really in the 1920s. And the two countries leading the way in that, ironically, were the United States and Russia, then the Soviet Union after the revolution. There were a lot of well, not a lot, but there were a small core of devoted rocket enthusiasts who were doing really sophisticated work. Rocketry goes back to the 20s, really. Yeah, I think I see a hand.
What was the effect of the shooting down of the U-2 with Gary Powers? What effect did that have on the space program, and how did the Russians do it?
That's two very, very good questions. One is it had very little effect on the space program. It had an enormous effect on Soviet-American relations. Khrushchev pitched a fit and blew up the summit meeting in 1960, and so on. How the Russians did it is a very, very interesting question, because they did it with a proximity fuse. They couldn't hit the U-2, but they were getting closer and closer and closer. And a proximity, in other words, they had a warhead that would explode when it got near the target. And the explosion, the U-2 was aluminum foil, basically. I mean, it was a really light, thin plane that was designed to stay in the air a long time with the fuel it could carry, and a lot of the weight was fuel. It was not designed for anything except surveillance, and it was fragile as it could be. And Americans, one of the reasons Gary Power and the story the State Department put out was that it was a weather observation, because everyone believed that any pilot would not survive a crash of the U-2 because it was so fragile. And I guess when you ask the flip side how they did that, one of the most interesting things is that's one of the things that Julius Rosenberg stole and gave to the Soviets was the proximity fuse. And you can make a very good argument that the proximity fuse was a much more, he stole his ring stole atomic secrets. He passed them to the Soviets too. For those who aren't aware, in the 1990s, the opening of Venona, which was an American project. The United States had intercepted Soviet cable traffic, had broken the Soviet code, and there's a storehouse full of this intercepted Soviet cable traffic. The Venona decrypts that were made public in the 1990s established not beyond a reasonable doubt, cosmic certainty that the Rosenbergs were engaged in spying. But the atomic secrets that they passed to the Soviets were really technology. I mean, the Soviets understood the technology of an atomic device as well as the United States did, and a lot of other countries. It was a matter of technology, not science. And so while those were important, what the Rosenberg stole were important, they weren't really key to the Soviet development of atomic weapons. The proximity fuse was the real deal, and that was something that was much more important, and ironically, it's what brought down Gary Power's U-2 plane.
Well, I think some of our questions, do we have another person?
While you're taking that back there's sort of one other curious thing. One thing that came out, the Soviet cable traffic that I mentioned mostly came out of their consulate in New York. They figured the embassy in Washington was being tapped in one way or another. And when Julius Rosenberg was fired from the Army Signal Corps in the 40s, not for spying, they didn't know he was spying. They found that he'd lied about having been a communist on his military intake papers. And so he was fired. I mean, he wasn't prosecuted or anything, he was just fired. And the Soviets were hysterical. I mean, and there's a letter from Moscow to New York saying, look, we have to make a correct assessment about this. And, that Stalinist language, a correct assessment. The big concern was that they were losing, as they said, a guy who's not only proven to be a good spy, but he can run other spies, and it's like a letter of recommendation. You would love to have that on your FEC report. I hope somewhere someone's written a letter like that about my work somewhere. Again, if you have any doubts about that, take a look at the Venona decrypts. Not to mention the stuff that came out of the KGB archives when they were opened up briefly after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was another hand. Yeah.
So the nuclear weapons now, then the race was in the 40s. We had an atomic bomb. In the 50s, a hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
So are the nuclear weapons now going up in the ISP? Are those hydrogen bombs now then?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact technology. I assume they're basically fusion weapons. Although you're talking to the wrong guy. I mean, there are people who know a lot more about physics I see out in the audience than I do. The difference was the atom bomb was a fission bomb. It was created. The power was released by splitting the atom. The hydrogen bomb, or super as it was called, is a bomb that is actually triggered by a fission explosion, but it actually creates a fusion of particles and releases just infinitely more energy.
And I think next week with Nancy Hinman, we'll get some answers to some of the science behind it.
Yeah, that would be better.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks for coming.